Welcome to Neo Nexus. Today we're witnessing a seismic shift in U.S. trade policy, one that could reshape the global economic landscape. Subscribe and hit the bell icon for updates. You won't want to miss the fallout from this historic Supreme Court decision. The Supreme Court has just struck down President Trump's controversial Liberation Day tariffs, sending shockwaves through Washington and beyond. These tariffs, which acted as sweeping taxes on imported goods, were designed to make foreign products more expensive and boost American industry. Tariffs have long been used as tools for economic protection and political leverage, but Trump's approach was unprecedented in its scale and scope. In April 2025, President Trump announced the Liberation Day tariffs, targeting nearly every nation and a vast array of products. The administration claimed these tariffs were necessary to pressure countries like China, Mexico, and Canada to help stop the flow of illicit fentanyl into the U.S., framing it as a national security emergency. The legal justification? The International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA, a law meant to give the president special powers during emergencies. Trump's team argued the fentanyl crisis warranted this sweeping use of power, but critics called it a dangerous overreach and a misreading of the law. Traditionally, IEEPA was used for targeted sanctions, not for imposing broad-based tariffs on global trade. This was a bold, controversial move. Unlike previous tariffs on steel and aluminum, these new measures were far more expansive, affecting nearly every sector of the economy. But now, the Supreme Court has stepped in, overturning the Liberation Day tariffs and setting a powerful new precedent for presidential authority. This decision is sending ripples through businesses, trade partners, and the legal world. The economic and political consequences could be enormous. The core issue: can a president use emergency powers to impose sweeping tariffs, or does that authority belong to Congress? The Supreme Court has now weighed in. In this episode, we'll unpack what this landmark ruling means for the future of U.S. trade, presidential power, and the global economy. Let's dive in. Legal challenges erupted across the country, as citizens, advocacy groups, and legal experts quickly mobilized in response to the administration's actions. As soon as the tariffs were announced, headlines blared and the public's attention turned to the courts, where the legality of the president's move would be tested. Importers and trade groups wasted no time. They sued, arguing that President Trump had overstepped his authority under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA, which they claimed did not allow for such sweeping tariff measures. The U.S. Court of International Trade took up the case and, after careful consideration, agreed with the challengers, ruling that only Congress has the constitutional authority to impose taxes like tariffs. The court emphasized that the language of IEEPA didn't explicitly grant the president this power, highlighting the importance of clear legislative intent when it comes to such significant economic decisions. The administration quickly appealed, insisting that the president needed broad and flexible tools to address national emergencies and protect American interests. The Federal Circuit Court of Appeals reviewed the case and ultimately upheld the lower court's decision, reaffirming that the power to tax and impose tariffs rests with Congress, not the executive branch. The courts made it clear: regulating commerce, which the president can do in certain situations, is not the same as imposing taxes, a power reserved for lawmakers. With two courts siding against the administration, the case was now destined for the Supreme Court, where the highest justices in the land would weigh in on this pivotal constitutional question. The stakes had grown dramatically. This was no longer just about tariffs, but about the fundamental balance of power between the executive and legislative branches of government. The final decision would not only resolve this dispute but also shape the future of presidential authority in trade and set a precedent for generations to come. Facing defeat in lower courts, the Trump administration found itself at a critical crossroads. The legal challenges to the tariffs had gained momentum, and the administration's arguments were repeatedly rejected by federal judges, leaving their trade policy in jeopardy. In response, the administration urgently petitioned the Supreme Court, seeking a last line of defense to uphold its sweeping tariff measures. The stakes were enormous, and the legal team knew that only the highest court could provide a definitive answer. They argued that overturning the tariffs would not only undermine U.S. trade strategy, but could also force the government to pay back up to $1 trillion in refunds to importers. Such a move, they claimed, would send shockwaves through the economy and disrupt global supply chains. By the time the case reached the Supreme Court, $72 billion in tariff revenue had already been collected, money that was now in legal limbo as the nation awaited a final decision. Treasury officials warned that refunding these tariffs would devastate the federal budget, potentially forcing cuts to essential government programs and services. Recognizing the urgency and national significance, the Supreme Court agreed to hear the case on an expedited schedule, signaling just how consequential their ruling would be for the country. At the heart of the case was a fundamental constitutional question. Could the president invoke emergency powers to impose sweeping tariffs, or did such authority rest solely with Congress? The answer would define the balance of power between the branches of government. Businesses, consumers, and government officials all anxiously awaited the outcome, knowing that billions of dollars and the very rules of international trade hung in the balance. For companies, the case was about more than just money. It was about legal certainty, the predictability of future trade policy, and the limits of executive power in shaping the economy. The Supreme Court's ruling would set a precedent that could shape U.S. trade policy for generations, affecting not only this administration, but all those to come. The world watched closely as the highest court in the land prepared to decide the fate of the Liberation Day tariffs, aware that the outcome would ripple across global markets. The stakes couldn't be higher, and the decision would echo far beyond the courtroom steps. On September 12, 2025, the Supreme Court struck down the Liberation Day tariffs. The court ruled that Trump's use of IEPA to impose broad tariffs exceeded presidential authority. The majority opinion reaffirmed that only Congress can levy taxes and duties, as stated in the Constitution. The justices found no clear authorization in IEPA for the president to create sweeping import taxes. The decision immediately invalidated the tariffs, ending their collection. The ruling was a major victory for businesses, and a sharp check on executive power in trade. The court clarified, regulating commerce isn't the same as imposing fiscal measures like tariffs. The U.S. now faced the challenge of unwinding the financial consequences of these now illegal taxes. With the tariffs overturned, the government must refund every dollar collected, potentially up to $1 trillion. This creates a massive fiscal challenge, forcing the Treasury to find ways to pay back importers. The refund process will be complex, involving detailed claims and potentially years to resolve. Third-party firms are already offering to buy refund rights from importers, highlighting the scale and value of these claims. The government's obligation is clear, but the logistics and timeline are daunting. For businesses, meticulous records will be crucial to claim their share. The Treasury now faces what could be the largest collective claim for damages in U.S. history. The Supreme Court's decision has turned a presidential policy into a fiscal crisis. The end of the tariffs means relief for both businesses and American families. Tariffs raise prices for everyone, importers, retailers, and ultimately consumers. With the tariffs gone, the average household could save over $1,000 next year as prices on goods drop. For companies, the ruling brings direct cost relief and much-needed certainty for planning and investment. Small and medium businesses in particular will benefit from lower import costs. The decision may also spark class action lawsuits from consumers seeking compensation for inflated prices. Proving direct pass-through costs will be complex, but the legal landscape is shifting. The economic unwinding of this policy is just beginning. The Supreme Court's ruling limits but doesn't eliminate presidential tariff authority. The decision only blocks the use of IEEPA for broad-based tariffs. The president still has tools like Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act for targeted tariffs on national security grounds. Section 301 of the Trade Act allows tariffs in response to unfair trade practices after formal investigation. These powers require specific justification and can't be used for sweeping global tariffs. The ruling forces future presidents to use the right legal tools for targeted actions. Congress's role in trade policy is reaffirmed, restoring a traditional balance of power. Any future tariffs will need to be more narrowly tailored and legally justified. The Supreme Court's decision reshapes American trade policy, putting broad tariff authority back in Congress's hands. The removal of the Liberation Day tariffs should lower prices and ease inflation for consumers. Businesses gain stability and predictability in the trade environment. The government now faces the challenge of efficiently refunding billions in illegal tariffs. Future administrations will need to work with Congress or use more targeted legal tools for trade actions. The era of sweeping unilateral tariffs is over, but trade disputes will continue on new legal grounds. This ruling is a powerful reminder of constitutional checks and balances. As the U.S. moves forward, the balance of power in trade policy has been clarified and reset.